This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest is on the line from New York, but we're going to be discussing Trinidad and Tobago this week on the LatinNews Podcast. No less than Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith, a scholar turned writer, retired political scientist who has served as the president of Fort Valley State University, the vice chancellor of the University of Guyana, provost of universities in Virginia and New York, and dean at Florida International University. He's an expert on Caribbean affairs and a prolific author with 10 books to his name. So, Ivelaw, welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you, Richard, and delighted to be able to join you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure for us because obviously we're going to be talking about Trinidad and Tobago, which does not make the headlines as much as we may like, but to get an expert on the show to talk to us in depth about some of the issues taking place on this island so close to the mainland of South America. So we can imagine that it's being also affected by much of what is the problem in South America. Perhaps we should start, Ivelaw, with a little bit of background of what we read at the moment. And I just saw a piece out online about the US State Department putting on a warning for kidnapping of US citizens in Trinidad and Tobago. So what is going on?
Well, I think there are a number of realities, some of which are complicated by misinformation, or as one person said a couple of years ago, alternative facts. But there's a harsh reality facing Trinidad and many other Caribbean jurisdictions of a long-standing challenge of crime and violence. The crime and violence manifests itself in many ways, including the problem of kidnapping periodically. Thankfully, Trinidad, a decade and a half ago, had a much more significant challenge with kidnapping. And some of that kidnapping was internal family dynamics. But it's not surprising to see periodic travel advisories by the United States, travel advisories by the United Kingdom, by Canada, about circumstances of crime. As a matter of fact, there is some political consternation in Trinidad right now over some action taken by the British government a few weeks ago, where the British government has reintroduced visas for any Trinidadian wanting to go to Britain. And that is a result of some immigration challenges resulting from Trinidadians overstaying their visas, but also criminality, which is suspected to be part of a link between Trinidad and Britain. So it's not unexpected, not surprising to me, and to others who follow Trinidad and the Caribbean closely, to see a travel advisory. Don't go. Sometimes the travel advisories say don't go to the country. Sometimes they say don't go to particular parts of the country. And the reason they give may be invariably related to crime and violence.
Yes, and in the list that I saw, there's sort of 9 or 10 different places listed. I imagine that a lot of them are urban, maybe Port of Spain and so on. I would say probably more humble areas of the city. This about the visa is very interesting because it does seem to be not just a place like Trinidad. I know it's occurred for Colombia, where I'm located. It seems to be very much a practice for the region, British foreign policy practice, sadly, as is going on. And you would think with the relationship and the post-colonial relationship between Trinidad and Britain, there might be a bit more understanding.
One would think so.
One would think so.
But sometimes national interests trump understandings, at least understandings by people like myself and like you. And this is an unfortunate. I know that the Trinidadian folks are upset. I would be upset as well if I were in their position. And they're working diplomatically to see if we can have a resumption of that fairly smooth movement of people, business and individuals between Trinidad and Tobago and United Kingdom.
So this brings me quite neatly to a point that there has been a surge in violent crime on the island. This is a gang problem. Can you give me a bit more information? Who are these gangs?
Let me share with you something I said in another podcast. I recorded a podcast when I was in Grenada last week, a relatively new podcast called Caribbean Tea, region-wide. We're looking at the problem of crime in the region as a whole. And I took the opportunity there to share what my sense is regarding gangs. My sense, as I said there, is that there is some alternative facts about gangs in the region. You hear about these hundreds of gangs. And I said to the person who asked me the question, if you can give me a list of 10 gangs in your country, he was from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I'll give you $100. If you, Richard, can identify or get someone in Trinidad to list these 106 gangs that they say exist, I'll give him $1,000. My suspicion is that you have a media sensationalism about not only the scope of gangs, but the number of gangs. I suspect you have in Trinidad, as you have in other parts of the world, some wannabe gangsters. Mm-hmm. You have some small-time operators who prey in their neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Their operations get now blown out of proportion to be gangs. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing one report where you must have heard about this Jamaat al-Muslimin, the religious group that perpetrated the coup in 1990 Trinidad and Tobago. Defined as a gang. I said to myself, what's a gang? So I suspect that although there is a relationship between gang existence and crime and violence, the number of gangs that you often hear about, I suspect they don't exist. I would hazard a conjecture that you maybe have 20, 30 real gangs. And by gangs, I mean organized relationships of individuals who have an intent to prosecute crime. Whether the crime is drug related, or whether it is simply burglary, or whether it is prior larceny, I think there is criminality around gangs, but I don't think you've got a mass number of hundreds of gangs running around Trinidad and Tobago executing their projects. But I would say this, the current state of emergency, we'll come back to talk a little bit about it just now, I hope, is not unprecedented. The book I did that came out last year, Drugs, Challenge Sovereignty. I have a chapter where I look at two sets of national strike regional traumas. One was the 2010 experience in Jamaica, and that was gang related, a posse, shower posse. And I took a look at the state of emergency declared in 2011. That state of emergency was one of the very traumatic experiences of Trinidad, and it had to do with gang and other criminal activity. So the state of emergency declared 1st December of last year is not the first experience. And I think it is wise of the government to have gone beyond it for being a 30-day, to extend it until April of this year. April 13 is the time permitted under the Constitution, given what the president declared for the state of emergency to exist. But I find it interesting that there is no overlap between the state of emergency period and elections. The state of emergency is likely to should end by April 13, elections to be held 2 weeks afterwards. So in other words, I think the ruling government elites quite rightly appreciate the severity politically of the impact of the existing state of emergency, were the state of emergency to continue during elections. You don't want to have state of emergency during elections. I think that's a wise move. But the existence of the state of emergency suggests the significant perennial challenge of criminality. And it rose to the point where Prime Minister Rowley and his cabinet felt that you need to arrest the problem by imposing some restrictions on rights. That is what a state of emergency amounts to.
Okay. What kind of rights are we imposing restrictions on then?
Well, states of emergency have a number of obligations and limitations. Among the limitations is that sometimes you can't move as freely and at any time as you want. There
Okay.
may be curfew periods imposed. Travel between X and Y times are restricted. You may have limitations of your right to due process limited.
Mm.
You may have limitations on the extent to which you have the right to have representation.
Mm-hmm.
You may be arrested without representation until later on when you have the right to bring an attorney into it. So there are a number of restrictions, and I took the trouble in this book to explain in detail, if you go to chapter 6, I think it is, what states of emergency really mean. They curtail limits, but they also extend the authority of the law enforcement agencies.
Mm.
The powers of arrest become a little more robust on the part of the civil and the military authorities. Both the police and the army now have some powers of arrest and ways to conduct themselves that are beyond what their normal course of conduct is outside of a state of emergency.
Yes. So this is explored in your book, Challenged Sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk, I mean, I need to touch more on these gangs problem. And now, so you say maybe 20 to 30 real gangs,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the 106 that someone is claiming. But where have they emerged from? Are they related to, let's say, the Tren de Aragua in Venezuela, which of course is so close? Or is there a relationship with maybe the lawlessness in Haiti or maybe some of the gangs in Jamaica? Is it a regional thing?
There are regional connectivities, and the regional connectivities invariably have to do with some of the things that LatinNews have been involved in, drugs. The regional connectivity extends to relationships to people in Jamaica because of the drugs. I don't have any evidence of a regional connectivity to Haiti.
Okay.
One of the interesting realities of Haiti is Haitian and gangs seem to be focused entirely internally. Mm-hmm. Of course, they get the weapons from Miami, and they get the weapons from other parts of the United States. But I would not be surprised to see I would not be surprised if there are robust developing relationship with gang operators and elements, individual radical entrepreneurs in Venezuela.
Mm.
And
go on, please.
I'm hoping we get some time to talk about the mass deportation, because I've got some particularly anxious moments because of the mass deportation to Venezuela. Mm-hmm. I worry about cross-border operations becoming enhanced. Mm-hmm. You know, the reality is that everyone who's deported to a country doesn't stay in that country. And sometimes they may stay in that country, but they develop relationships to prosecute their criminal enterprise in places beyond the borders of the country they're in. So I worry about Trinidad. Even after the state of emergency will have been lifted in April, I worry about people going back to Venezuela, given the existing, it's only 6 miles to separate parts of Venezuela from Trinidad. And the movement is fairly robust. The limitations on the part of the security forces of Trinidad, those limitations are there. And criminality moves beyond boundaries, beyond borders.
It's a real issue. It's a real issue, this, as you said, that how close Venezuela is. And I can imagine the transshipment of the transnational drugs trade and arms trafficking from Venezuela to Trinidad is key. And then, of course, as you say, at the moment, the government in the US claims that every person that they are repatriating to Venezuela is the Tren de Aragua. Of course, there will be members of the Tren de Aragua who are deported, and yes, they'll be looking at Trinidad. I would suspect, as you are suggesting, that Trinidad is very much in the crosshairs of this kind of thing. So
absolutely,
this could definitely worsen the situation.
But let me say, Richard, that I think it's important to worry not only about the criminal gangs sent back to Venezuela, whether they are part of Tren, as would be the case with other jurisdictions to which people are returned. All the deportees are not necessarily violent criminals. Some people will have been involved in the criminal justice system in the United States for a variety of reasons. Some people overstayed their visa and they had jobs, they were doing things, they built families. I was reading, quite sadly, a family in California, Colombian family.
Mm-hmm.
Husband is 59, the wife is 55. They've been here for 35 years, have 3 kids, first grandchild, never regularized their status.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're being returned to Colombia. So a lot of the people who may be sent back to Colombia, to Trinidad, there are a number of Trinidadians on the list, as you know, to be deported, are not necessarily violent, gang-related individuals. But sometimes, even if you're not involved in criminal activity, when your economic circumstances force you, you become inclined to be involved, whether by an act of commission or an act of omission. So I worry about, other than the known criminal enterprise operators, whether in the Tring or else, those other citizens who reported, other individuals reported, who may not be violent criminal related, but now there are opportunities for them to do things that are not legal in the country to which they deported.
This is true. If we're talking about this, let's say, state of emergency it will come to an end, as you said, on April the 13th. Let's just have a little look back. Carnival just took place in Trinidad, a huge event. Mm-hmm. Was this indeed affected? Has it affected tourism, the state of emergency, for a period that is so important for the country's GDP?
You know, I had a friend who died about a decade or so ago, and he once said to me, talking about Trinidad and Tobago, say, if people in Trinidad were to invest the kind of energy and zest for life throughout the year as they do during the time of Carnival, Trinidad would be a wonderful place. And the state of emergency did not stop the fun, Richard. I have a friend who lives in Miami, where I lived for 12 years. He's in his 80s. He went back to Trinidad for the Carnival. And he is only one of several people who want to be conscious of the realities of the society, state of emergency, conscious of the crime and violence that are there, but did not allow the state of emergency to interrupt the bacchanal, as they say.
This practice is replicated through the region, I think. The importance of Carnival. It's pre-Carnival, Carnival, post-Carnival, and then preparing for Carnival the rest of the year round.
Yes.
Now, the April 13th date, lifting the state of emergency, it allows for, obviously, the political parties to really get out there and campaign. And of course, it's going to allow for the freedom of movement. There won't be these restrictions. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about the political parties. We've got the ruling People's National Movement, the Prime Minister, Keith Rowley. He's stepping aside. And, well, it's the current energy minister, right? Stuart Young, who's leading the party.
Well, he's actually stepped aside already, Rowley. Aside already. 2 Mondays ago, I looked at there was a 4-hour-long political rally where the transition happened from Rowley to Stuart Young. And the next day, Stuart Young was formally appointed by the president as prime minister. So he's now actually running the government. And he has established a new cabinet, brought in some new people, reshuffled some of the chairs in his leadership team. And Stuart Young has brought the kind of dynamism and energy to the party and to the nation, which I anticipate will translate into victory at the polls on the 28th of April. And particularly in the context of recognizing the realities of the society. Yes, we've got a problem with crime. Yes, we have a problem with the relationship with Venezuela. One of the big challenges that he will have has begun to have, is navigating the relationship with Venezuela and the relationship with the United States. Because, as you know, the United States has now taken a heavy hand against Venezuela, and the Dragon gas project between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela will be under new scrutiny. But I think all things considered, And given what my assessment of the strength of the opposition of the UNC is all about, I would not be surprised if Mr. Stuart Young is victorious at the polls.
I can imagine that, I'm just thinking out loud right now, that crossover of Rowley stepping aside, let's say the beginning of March or mid-March, and then Stuart Young, now Prime Minister. The opposition are furious with this opportunity for the incumbent party to re-energize prior to the elections. What kind of reaction is going on with the party, the United National Congress?
Well, they're outrage, I think, is the word that comes to mind. The former Prime Minister, head of the UNC, Kamala Bissessa, even threatened to sue. Said that the PNP is violating the Constitution by setting the stage for Rowley to give way to Young in violation of the Constitution. So Rowley said, let him sue. Let him take up to court. Yeah. So I think they're caught between a rock and a hard place in one respect significantly. Notwithstanding the problems of crime and economics and foreign policy that the Trinidadian society is now facing, the PNP has relative greater resonance with the national landscape. I'm told that the UNC is having difficulty in fielding candidates for all 41 constituencies. Now, if you can't get that rally 2 Sundays ago, the PNM brought out all 41 of their candidates. Here are our people contesting all the constituencies. They say, well, show us what you've got, UNC. PNM has their folks. And I think that one indicator that they're not as strong going in, at least 2 weeks ago, last week, when the Prime Minister Rowley formally gave way to Young, the absence of their identifying their constituency representatives running in the elections, I think, is an indication of they've got some challenges within their ranks.
They haven't been able to pull themselves up. Was Rowley's move unconstitutional in your opinion?
No.
Not at all.
No.
Okay.
Not unconstitutional. And in the context of Commonwealth jurisdictions, you can see the similar thing happening in Canada.
Yes.
And incidentally, what date did the new Prime Minister of Canada announce his elections?
Right now.
The same date. They're having Canadian election the same date as Trinidad elections. April 28th.
So there'll be Trinidadians voting in Canada for two elections. I find it fascinating, this as you're rightly so, the relationship with Canada and that Canadian similarity with the elections. Trinidad, obviously being a major player in the Caribbean, will be supporting Guyana, of course, in Guyana's claims and exploration in the petroleum. As you say, that the two major issues that the new government will need to deal with is relationship with Venezuela, relationship with the United States. This is a tricky moment. Can Trinidad position itself as a conduit between the US and Venezuela?
I don't know that the current political leadership in the US is disposed to having conduits in a country to the profile of Trinidad and Tobago. By that I mean, my sense is that President Trump, if he were to be disposed to having a conduit, will be looking for someone from a bigger country.
Yeah.
So it is likely that Brazil, perhaps, can be viewed as an acceptable conduit, but not little Trinidad and Tobago. Those little folks down there. But it's going to be a tight rope to walk, because it's a national self-interest of Trinidad, both to maintain their relationship with the oil and gas industry. And it's also in their interest to support Guyana.
Yes.
In the book that I'm writing on oil and climate change in Guyana, I spent 2 chapters looking at the Venezuela claim. And in one of the chapters, I think chapter 4, I took the trouble to explain Trinidad's role in serving as an interlocutor between Venezuela and Guyana. And that role fell to Prime Minister Eric Williams. Back in the late 60s, Eric Williams was able to ask Guyana and Venezuela to come to Port of Spain, and they signed something called the Protocol of Port of Spain. And the protocol said, look, let's freeze this claim for 12 years. Let's let sleeping dogs lie. Let's not pursue. Let's lower the decibel of jingoism. And at the end of the 12 years, we'll decide either to renew or to access other mechanisms set out under the Geneva Agreement. I'll tell you, Richard, my first visit to Caracas was in 1981, as the end of the Protocol of Port of Spain was fast approaching. I was a journalist. I did what you did. I was a journalist back then. And my first 2 days in Caracas, I couldn't understand why the national anthem is being played so frequently. It didn't take me long to realize that the national anthem's frequency of being played, along with the description of Venezuela in Venezuela, had to do with the claim against Guyana. It was a kind of a nationalistic, jingoistic thing. But it was a successful intervention by Eric Williams in 1970 to get both Caracas and Georgetown to ease it, lower the level of rhetoric, lower the level of anxiety about the dispute. But as you know, things have taken off in dramatic, not so nice ways since then.
Well, those were different times as well, and obviously Venezuela leading OPEC production for petroleum at that time, and so on. It's different times. So if we go back to the actual political situation in Trinidad and Tobago, so you're very confident in a Stuart Young victory on April 28th. Is there a possibility, because of course the other issue that we've been touching on a lot, criminality, is there a possibility of cross-party cooperations between the United National Congress and the People's National Movement regarding security?
This book that I produced last year, Challenge Sovereignty, Trinidad hosted a huge book launch. It was sponsored by the Ministry of National Security Trinidad, the Institute of International Relations, and the CARICOM Impacts.
Yes.
Invitations were extended to not only folks in the government, but folks in the opposition. Guess how many people from the opposition showed up? Zero. Now, if you can use that as an indication, yes, it's a book and it's a conversation with national security in Trinidad. But I don't know if it's the fact that the Minister of National Security was giving the keynote or what, but there was no indication of a willingness to mend fences, even if it's in an academic forum. So I suspect you'd get a lot of platitudes about collaboration. But when it comes to practices, I think you're likely to see reservation rather than anxiety to cooperate. So I don't anticipate collaboration across the political aisles on this matter. I see people pulling up their stakes and getting a little more individualistic. I wouldn't be surprised, though, talking about crossing, if there aren't efforts on the part of one party to get others to cross from their side of the aisle to the others.
Is it pretty fluid then? Is it these things happen frequently?
Yeah, people are enticed across the floor. But I suspect that any crossing will be done more over to the PNM.
Of course.
Than over to the UNC.
Well, you go across to the winning party. But
Absolutely. Where the perceived strength and
yes,
likely victory exists.
and entirely individualistic there, thinking of yourself. What do you think then? If Young comes in and wins, will he place another state of emergency on as soon as he gets back in?
I don't see the political utility of doing that unless you've got circumstances that have been aggravated to a point where the upsurge is dramatic. Let's say the upsurge has to do with the Venezuela connection. Never say never, but
yes,
it is not in the political, it's not politically expedient for any new prime minister to bring back a state of emergency, especially one that was there when he was in office, even though not fully elected as popular prime minister. But Richard, before we go too far, I want to mention that part of the challenge that Trinidad has had on the cross-border criminality is not only related to drugs and to guns. There's been a significant human trafficking problem, and human trafficking of not only young girls and sometimes not so young girls from Venezuela, but young girls from Colombia and other places looking for economic opportunity beyond their national boundaries. I was telling some folks in the police high command in Grenada last week of something I explained in this book. Trinidad and Tobago passed legislation to deal with human trafficking. The first set of people arrested under this new law, Trinidad and Tobago police officers. They were running a trafficking ring of these young girls. So the human trafficking is also something to keep on the radar screen. It's guns, it's drugs, it's humans.
Is there a possibility of strengthening, let's say, the judicial system, the institutions, so that this does not occur as, let's say, brazenly as it possibly is now?
There is always room for improvement in every jurisdiction, including in the United States, to improve the extent to which the functionality of the various components of the judiciary, well, I should say, various components of the judicial architecture.
Yes.
Like so many other jurisdictions, there's a problem of overcrowding jails and prisons.
Yeah.
The overcrowded jails means sometimes it's a reflection of the lethargy of people who are arrested being moved along the prosecutorial chain and don't have to spend years or even months in the lockups in the jails. Trinidad over the years they've built new prisons, have expanded the number of judges, but there still is scope to do a little better in very many of those areas of the criminal justice architecture.
As we wind this down, obviously what we're talking about, it gives you've put us at ease a bit about the security issues. It's really, yes, there are issues. Yes, things need to change. There aren't 106 gangs, maybe 20 to 30, as you mentioned. Is Trinidad, in let's say the context of the Caribbean region, is it any worse, or is it than other countries? Let's say Jamaica and others. Is it any worse than these countries, or are we, as you say, what's it called? The alternative? Was it the alternative facts that we're talking about?
Well, there's an old precept called Miles' Law: where you stand depends on where you sit. And I think that applies as in any jurisdiction, where you stand. If you're standing in the circumstance of the police in Trinidad is the worst place because of the criminals. But if you're in Jamaica, although Jamaica has had a decline as Trinidad in the number of homicides, their circumstances are still worse than Trinidad and Tobago. So I think if you do, it depends upon what you compare Trinidad to.
Yeah.
It is much better circumstance in Trinidad than it is in Haiti.
Yes. Well,
It's a much better circumstance in Trinidad than it is in Jamaica. So I think it depends on the snapshot you're looking at and what lens you're looking through. Whatever the lens you're looking through, it will be in the interest of Trinidadians to have an improvement of the conditions of criminality, conditions of their economy, and so they can feel less compelled to want to have states of emergency. You know, talking about states of emergency in the Caribbean, there's states of emergency in Jamaica right now. Not to the entire island, but in sections of the island. So from the vantage point of where you stand depends on where you sit.
Well, listen, thank you, Ivelaw. It has been really illuminating to discuss Trinidad in such depth. Of course, there are challenges ahead, but it doesn't seem quite as bad as it is made out with the alternative facts, let's say, from media outlets and so on. So I wish you the best with these new books. I know that you have Oil and Climate Change in Guyana coming out very soon.
Very soon. Maybe we can talk about that when it comes out.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Of course, I think it would be highly prescient given what's going on in Guyana and Venezuela and so on. And I know that you were just on a book tour for your book, Sylvie's Love and Loss. And of course, you've mentioned your books, Challenge, Sovereignty, and of the Quest for Security in the Caribbean. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith, scholar turned writer, a retired political scientist who has served as president of Fort Valley State University, vice chancellor of the University of Guyana, provost of universities in Virginia and New York, and dean at the Florida International University. Thank you for coming on the
LatinNews
Richard.
Podcast. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
You too. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.